Hi, in this video I want to have a conversation about attack helicopters. By conversation, I really mean that sincerely. One thing that's really been a pleasure for me with these videos that I've been doing is that a lot of you, my audience, have had a lot of really good things to say in the comments, a lot of really good informed opinions, people bringing some really good information, stuff I didn't know, stuff I probably should have known, etc. So I'm really inviting you to weigh in here. And if this is your first time watching my channel, my name is Michael Shurkin, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Pax Americana, a conversation about world affairs, global conflict, military strategy, and anything else that happens to be on my mind. Now, it so happens that attack helicopters have been on my mind quite a bit ever since I did a video interview on this channel with my friend Nick Drummond, who's like a British land warfare expert. And somewhere up here, I put a link to the video interview that I did with Nick Drummond. The topic of the interview was really not about helicopters, but he did say in passing that he thought that attack helicopters really didn't have a place anymore in the modern battlefield. And his argument was the following. First of all, attack helicopters cost a lot of money. Secondly, air defenses were becoming denser and denser. And the reason why air defenses were becoming denser and denser has to do with drones. Because of drones, armies were having to develop better and more comprehensive air defense capabilities. So this is making everything a whole lot more dangerous for helicopters. And then finally, the fact of the matter is that drones increasingly can do many of the things that attack helicopters can do. Arguably, they can't do it as well as attack helicopters. But remember, attack helicopters cost a lot of money. Drones cost radically less money. And you can make lots of them, and they're attritable. So that might actually just be a better option. But, I mean, this makes sense. But first of all, we should always be leery about statements like this. I mean, how many times do people say that the main battle tank is dead or the aircraft carrier is dead or et cetera, et cetera? So if somebody's going to come and say, the attack helicopter is now dead, maybe, maybe not. You got to really ask some questions. Also, we should add that not everybody thinks this way. So, for instance, Poland, which has been going on this big splurge for defense capabilities, has just signed a deal with the United States. This was last year, I believe, to spend for $10 billion. $10 billion. Poland is buying 96 H-64E Apache helicopters, plus a lot of the stuff that goes with it, some of the weapons, equipment, training, support stuff, etc. So it's not $10 billion for the 96 helicopters, but it's still a lot. And I try to figure out exactly how much Poland is paying for each of the airframes, and that's nearly impossible to do. But from what I've read, a current Apache, which is the H-64E, costs somewhere between $50 million and, let's say, the $100 million that Poland is paying. Either way, it's a lot of money. So Poland, though, obviously thinks that there's still a reason to have things like Apaches around. So are they right? Is Drummond right? What do we make of this? And that's what I want to try to figure out. Now, in order to do this, I'm going to divide this video into several parts, and I've put timestamps in the description so that you can jump from part to part, and also just to, guide you through the conversation. The first part, I want to just define attack helicopters and talk about what they are. I mean, what even is an attack helicopter? Secondly, I want to go over basically what attack helicopters are supposed to be able to do. This is really a question of doctrine. You see, militaries don't, or at least they shouldn't, just buy stuff because they're cool. What militaries are supposed to do is have a real clear idea about how they want to fight their wars, and then what they need in order to fight the wars the way that they intend to fight them. That's the way it's supposed to work. So what do they envision using attack helicopters for? What's the idea? So I want to lay that out sort of in very basic terms. Third, I want to give sort of a fairly brief overview over the historical use of attack helicopters, in a sense to get a sense of, well, how well have they actually done the things that they're supposed to be able to do? And then finally, we really have to talk about Ukraine, because Ukraine, both it's the most recent and it's an ongoing conflict, but in many ways Ukraine is testing, is the biggest, purest test of attack helicopters in a conventional war setting that we've had to date. And then finally, part 5, I want to make some concluding remarks. Okay, so first of all, what even are attack helicopters? There may well be an official U.S. or NATO definition of attack helicopter, but what I really have in mind are things that are dedicated weapons platforms, things that have been designed for and designed to carry weapons and use the weapons. That's the whole point. They're gunships. And this is very different from just taking any old helicopter and putting weapons on them. I mean, something that's sort of built around it, and really that's the entire primary function of the helicopter. The original one, the first true attack helicopter, was the AH-1 Cobra, which the U.S. Army fielded in Vietnam in 1966. And nowadays we have the Americans have the H-64 Apache, which many other countries have these. We have the European Tiger. The Italians have the Mangusta, and they're working now on a replacement for the Mangusta. And then you've got Russian aircraft like the Mi-24, the Mi-28, and of course the Kamov Ka-52, which frankly I think takes the prize for being the coolest of them all. Although, man, that coaxial double rotor must be an engineering nightmare. But either way, I think these things are super neat. Now, alternatively, though, I think one can also think about one particular feature of attack helicopters that just qualitatively distinguishes them from any other kind of helicopter to which you've simply added weapons, and that is the integration of the anti-tank guided missile, the ATGM. Once people figured out that they could do that, suddenly the helicopter becomes a radically more lethal, radically more capable thing. And then people really ran with that. This happened in the early 1970s. That's also when they started putting them on the H-1 Cobras, because the OG Cobras that operated in Vietnam did not have this capability. But this is now sort of standard. And also, once you allow for that as a definition, or expanding our definition of attack helicopter, now you can classify as an attack helicopter things like the French Gazelle HOT, or I call them HOT. It's a French acronym that means nothing particular in any language, but these are Gazelles that have been modified in order to fire ATGMs, and that's what they're for. That's exclusively what they're for. That's the mission. That's why they exist in the French Army's TONE. Okay, this brings us to part two. What are helicopters, attack helicopters, for? Now, different militaries have different ideas about what they use attack helicopters for, different doctrines, some with different requirements, and also over time their understanding of what these things are for has evolved. In the American case, a lot of the evolution of the vision of the concept of the attack helicopter actually is the result of sniping and fighting between the Army and the Air Force about who does what in the division of labor. It's really very silly. I mean, roughly speaking, they've got this really weird agreement where basically fixed wing aircraft are the exclusive reserve of the Air Force, so if the Army decides that it needs aircraft, it has to go to rotary wing aircraft, which spurred the U.S. Army's embrace of the helicopter. And generally speaking, the Army often has been dissatisfied with close air support capabilities provided by the Air Force, so it sought to develop their own using rotary wings helicopters because it can't use force wings, but then the Air Force would push back because the Army was encroaching on its ground, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think this is particularly relevant for other militaries, but the point is that the idea of what helicopters are for often is a function of all sorts of weird variables. Anyways, in brief, we can say that the doctrinal mission of attack helicopters for most militaries, by and large, can be summed up as the following. We have reconnaissance or scouting. Then we have close air support. By this I mean providing fires in support of ground troops that are in contact with the enemy. Then we have interdiction, which basically means going behind the enemy lines and attacking the enemy or enemy units or assets that are not in contact with one's own ground forces. And then we have what I call like deep maneuver. This is almost like think about the blitzkrieg, the idea that you've got these mobile units that are going to sweep forward and go to the rear of other units and wreak havoc on the rear and the flanks, et cetera, et cetera. So four basic, I'm oversimplifying, but I think that as a general rule of thumb, this works pretty well. Now, it is worth noting that in the U.S. case, the original function of attack helicopters, like those Cobras, it really was for close air support. But then, and I think particularly once they really became impressed by the pairing of the attack helicopter with the ATGM, they kind of got excited and used their imagination, sort of imagined other uses for it, and they began to conceive of the possibility of using attack helicopters as highly mobile anti-armor units that could do raids that go deep into enemy territory and do interdiction missions, etc. In fact, when you look at the air-land battle concept of the 1980s, attack helicopters play an important role in supporting maneuver warfare. And there's this vision of these attack helicopter formations moving forward, attacking enemy lines, going behind enemy lines, etc. It should be pretty obvious that for all of these basic missions, attack helicopters are amazing. They're fast, they're well armed, there's so many things that they can do. But they can only perform their mission if nobody's shooting them down. And this is a real problem because, by and large, as a general rule, helicopters are a lot more vulnerable than fixed-wing aircraft, just because of the way they're designed, the way they're built. They're slower, plus sometimes they have to slow down to fire. Plus, attack helicopters are intended to go where the fighting is and to go to the sound of the fighting and to get involved in the fighting. So, in other words, they're exposing themselves to risk in a way that fixed-wing aircraft never really do. The fixed-wing aircraft will sort of swoop over and drop a bomb, whereas these things are supposed to sort of be part of the mix. So they're better targets. They're easier targets. They linger at the battlefield, etc. This has always been the big question mark over attack helicopters, really since the very beginning. How serious is the threat to them? How vulnerable are they really? And are they still worthwhile, notwithstanding the threat to them? I should add that in the 1980s airland battle concept, the doctrine, as far as I understand, was really blithely sanguine about the air defense threat posed by Soviet forces in Central Europe. They basically were confident that the American forces, the Air Force, the ground forces, artillery, etc., would be able to suppress the enemy air forces to such an extent that the attack helicopters would be able to carry out the missions assigned to them. They would be able to run the gauntlet, maybe avoid the areas where the air defense capabilities are denser, etc. But they're like, no, this is fine. It's not really a problem. We can do this even against the Soviets in this big conventional military fight in which the Soviets clearly are bringing to the battle all of their copious air defense capabilities. Now, okay, so part three. This brings us to part three, though, the historical record. How well have attack helicopters actually done in the past? The fact of the matter is that attack helicopters, I would argue, have never been used in an environment anything like this sort of Cold War big clash with the Soviets with respect to air defense capabilities. In all the times that attack helicopters have been used, there have been maybe some air defense capabilities, but nothing like what was envisioned in terms of, fighting at the Fulda Gap in Germany in the 1980s. And that's very important to remember. Always some, but never what they're talking about. In fact, most of the time, I think that attack helicopters have been used. They've been used in environments in which there is almost no air defense capabilities. So, for instance, attack helicopters are used all the time in Africa, basically fighting bush wars, often like Mi-24s, like Mali, for instance, has Mi-24s. Chad has, I think they have attack helicopters, but I know in the past they would have like transport helicopters that would fire rockets, that kind of thing. But the threat to them is fairly minimal. The Israelis use a lot of attack helicopters. They've been using Cobras and Apaches since the late 1970s, but they never have used their attack helicopters in conventional wars against Arab armies. So in the last big conventional war in 1973, the Israelis did not have attack helicopters. So, and thus none of the fights the Israelis have gotten themselves into since 1973 have the Israelis faced any kind of serious air defense capabilities. So, of the instances, so this is what I'm interested in, instances in which attack helicopters have been used in environments with at least some air defense capabilities of note. Now, the examples that I've come up with are Vietnam. We have the Soviet-Afghan War from 1979-1989. We have Desert Storm, 1991. Task Force Hawk, that was in the Balkans, 1999. The Iraq War, 2003-2011. And then the Libya intervention in 2011. Now, we need to talk about Vietnam because that's, of course, where the story begins. I tend not to think about Vietnam as being a particularly dangerous place for aircraft, but that's just wrong. It's actually a very dangerous place for aircraft. A lot of American airmen got shot down. Rotary wing, fixed wing, whatever. It happened. The communists had air defense capabilities. In fact, the numbers for helicopters are really staggering. The U.S., I've read, deployed about 12,000 helicopters in Vietnam. It lost 2,500 of those in combat. So that's about 21% of the overall helicopter fleet. As for the AH-1 Cobra fleet, the U.S. deployed 1,100 of them, roughly, to Vietnam, and lost about 270 to combat. So that's about a quarter of all the Cobras that they used in Vietnam. That's a lot. Let's turn to the Soviet-Afghan War. Now, the Soviets in the Soviet-Afghan War made very heavy use of their Mi-24s. And initially, from what I read, the Soviets used these things with impunity, and the Mujahideen were terrified by them. Then, at some point, the Americans began supplying the Mujahideen with Stinger MANPADS, Man Portable Air Defense Systems. I think that's what that stands for. And this really changed everything, because once the MANPADS are around and the air defense threat now is significant, the Soviets then had to significantly adjust their tactics and how they use these things. So let's say the initial capabilities of an Mi-24 are like this. The Soviets, because the MANPADS, had to change how they use them. So now they're only getting this much value out of the Mi-24s. Among other things, they started trying to operate at night as much as they can. Also, they learned to fly at the nape of the earth or the terrain or whatever it's called, basically to hug the terrain, stay as low as possible, and only pop up in order to fire, exposing themselves to the risk of stingers, but then they would drop down as soon as they possibly can. Now, while they're flying low, they are exposed to ground fires, but the Soviet pilots basically decided that the risk represented by the ground fire was less than the risk represented by the MANPADS. So that's what they did. I mean, they changed their tactics and they operated much more cautiously. And basically, from then on, the Mi-24s were just never as effective and as capable as was initially the case. Okay, now we jump to Desert Storm. Now, Desert Storm is interesting. Desert Storm goes 1991. It's interesting because now here's an opportunity for the Americans to finally try out the air-land battle concept and to use attack helicopters in all the ways that American doctrine called for attack helicopters to be used, meaning they're going to do maneuver, they're going to use them as maneuver units, they're going to do deep strike, they're going to do interdiction, in addition to close air support. Now, from what I've read, they did all these things admirably. It worked very, very well. Part of it, what helped, is that the Americans were very good at hugging the terrain, which, by the way, is super easy to do when you're in the open desert. Also, the Americans were very good at identifying Iraqi air defense capabilities and suppressing them. And also because so much of the fighting was in the open desert, by the way, suppressing air defense is relatively easy to do because basically you can just blow the crap out of things, right? You can just send out barrages of rockets, artillery, or whatever. It's really easy to do. And so they did it. Now, from an American point of view, 91 seemed to validate American Army doctrine and Marine Corps doctrine when it came to using attack helicopters. I have to say, as sort of a sidebar or as sort of an aside, that I think that any time you'll read anywhere that Desert Shield validated any particular concept, I think you should just throw out. I think it's garbage. I don't think that Desert Shield validated anything other than the basic rule of thumb that in a conventional fight, a first-class military against a third or even fourth-class military, the first-class military is going to win. And I do not think that in all the annals of warfare there was modern warfare, was there a battle, a war that was so lopsided in terms of capabilities. And as a result, I think it's almost ridiculous to point to any particular doctrine or capability and say, oh, this is the greatest thing ever. Now we're going to have a revolution in military affairs, et cetera, et cetera. No. I mean, the analogy I often draw is, like if an elephant crushes a mouse, this isn't proof of the validity of the elephant's fighting techniques, right? It's just going to crush the mouse because that's just what happens. Anyway, kind of proof of this. A few years later, 8 years later, you have Task Force Hawk. And Task Force Hawk, the idea was that the U.S. decided to send 24 Apache helicopters to, I believe it was Macedonia, along with MLRS rockets. The rockets would be there to suppress air defense capabilities. And they were going to do raids into Kosovo in order to attack Serbian units that were difficult for fixed-wing aircraft to get at. So they're going to do deep attack, they're going to do interdiction, they're going to move around, they're going to do raids. It so happened, though, that by the time they finally got all this set up, and it was this whole very lengthy process, the American commanders decided not to risk it. They didn't actually do it. They didn't do it. They had all the capabilities, but they didn't. So why not? Well, for one thing, they realized that the Serbs are smart, and the Serbs carefully dispersed their forces. The Americans also realized that their intel about where the Serbs were and where their air defense capabilities were was not that great. Also, they realized that because of the terrain of Kosovo, the hills, and the fact that people live there and their buildings, there's plenty of cover for air defense units and other Serbian units, that they realized that their ability to suppress air defense capabilities was not at all what they wanted it to be. So, therefore, they didn't risk it. So the whole thing was a failure. Fast forward to 2003, the invasion of Iraq. The American military can never be accused of learning any lessons. Sorry. And so after Task Force Hawk, they're like, oh, never mind. There's no lesson to be learned there. And what they tried to do in 2003 in the invasion of Iraq is they thought they could replicate the success that they thought they had in the 1991 Operation Desert Shield. And it didn't work. The use of attack helicopters, at least for the conventional warfare phase of the war, was a failure. They were useful later when you have the insurrection, the insurgency, and now you're using Apaches for close air support. That was a different story. But when they're trying to use them in this air-land battle kind of thing with the deep strike, interdiction, it was a disaster. And the case in point, the great example that people cite is there was an attack organized by, I think it was like 30 Apaches against something called the Medina Division. And the idea was that they were going to go like past the line of the battle, where the battle was, past the front, go to the rear. They're going to attack the Medina Division and try to like take it out or destroy as much of it as they possibly could. The whole thing was a disaster. Lots of things went wrong. But the key thing is that the Iraqis apparently had studied Desert Storm and studied other attack helicopter operations. They learned a lot about attack helicopters, and they put a lot of thought. The Iraqis were ready. They were prepared. They dispersed things. They dispersed the air defense. They made clever use of the air defense. They were coordinated. They knew what they were doing. And what happened was that the Apaches ended up running back to base with their tail between their legs. Every one Apache got shot down. All the others sustained battle damage, and they reportedly failed to destroy anything, at least anything of any value with respect to the Medina Division. It was a total failure. Now, the next example is Libya. Libya is a more interesting or more successful example. You have Britain and France were involved. They used attack helicopters for deep strike and precision strike operations. The British used Apaches. The French used Tigers and Gazelle Hots. Interestingly, both forces flew their attack helicopters off of Navy ships, which I don't think was something that they had planned to do, but they did it. By all accounts, it was all a success. Why was it successful? From what I can tell, for one thing, they had very good intelligence, but then also I think that maybe Gaddafi's air defenses were relatively weak, and the Allies in this case were able to suppress those air defenses in a manner. They're much more effective than was the case when going up against the Iraqis in 2000. Okay, when all this is said, like if we take a step back and we look at the historical record, and we have to ask, like, okay, are attack helicopters useful? Now remember the four missions that I said. You've got reconnaissance, scouting, you've got close air support, you've got sort of a deep interdiction and deep strike, and then sort of maneuver, kind of like tanks. All four of these things are plausible, but in reality, everything changes if the enemy has serious air defense capabilities, if the environment is such where it's harder to identify those capabilities and deal with them, to suppress them. And this is also a function of how good your intelligence is. It's also a function of rules of engagement. So it's all about the environment. In the right kind of environment, they're very useful. In the wrong kind of environment, they're much less useful. Which brings us, of course, to the Ukraine war. I think the Ukraine war for attack helicopters is super interesting because, among other things, this is the war that comes closest to actually to the kind of scenario that American planners imagined, like in the 1980s with the air-land battle, where you're using helicopters in a conventional battle against enemy and an adversary that has robust air defense capabilities. And the idea is that you're going to use these helicopters for scouting, CAS, deep strike, etc. And it seems like when the Russians invaded in 2022, they brought a lot of helicopters to the table, and they intended to use the helicopters in all the ways dictated by Russian doctrine, which called for these things: the deep strike, the interdiction, the close air support, etc., etc. What happened in 2022 is that the Russian helicopters got decimated. The numbers are really striking. At least 100 attack helicopters were lost in the beginning, as many as 60 of the Ka-52s, which is, by the way, about half the entire pre-war fleet of these things. And more to the point, what the Russians quickly realized is that they had to change how they operated their attack helicopters. What they did was sort of the opposite of Afghanistan. So remember, in Afghanistan, once manpads came into the field, into theater, the Stingers, the Russians had to go from flying their helicopters at altitude to low altitude and hugging the terrain. risking ground fire, but they said that they thought that the ground fire was less dangerous than the Stingers. In this case, Ukrainian manpads and other air defense capabilities had the opposite effect. So, in the beginning of the war, the Russians were using low-altitude maneuvers like they had learned to do in Afghanistan, but that got them slaughtered. Now, because of the different manpad capabilities and the different countermeasure capabilities and the helicopters, the Russian pilots reckoned that actually they were safer at higher altitudes than at lower altitudes. And perhaps the most important thing is that the Russians started to basically avoid flying over the battlefield altogether. You don't do that because that's far too dangerous. Instead, they would keep their helicopters behind the lines, outside the reach of Ukrainian manpads, and then they would use the helicopters almost like artillery, and they would basically lob in these arcs, they would lob unguided missiles at the battlefield. Reportedly, this did have some value for suppressing the Ukrainians. So lobbing these missiles does have a certain value. But again, we're back to this idea that, in theory, an attack helicopter has this much capability. Manpads narrow the capabilities. And now you're just like lobbing unguided rockets from a distance. You're not getting a lot of value out of that attack helicopter, which costs millions and millions of dollars. In fact, if you put it another way, attack helicopters cost a ton of money. $50 million for an AH-64E. I don't know how much the Russian stuff costs. Probably cheaper, but still a lot of money, tens of millions of dollars. Now, an AH-64E has tremendous capabilities. So big expense, big capabilities. Therefore, as a value proposition, okay, maybe it's worth it. But once you reduce the capabilities that you're actually able to use, you reduce the things that you're actually able to use this thing for, then the value proposition becomes more and more dubious. And then, of course, we have to talk about two trends. And these are the things that are at the heart of Nick Drummond's argument. In Ukraine, what we're seeing, and as a result of what we're seeing in Ukraine, there are several things, two big important things happening. First, air defense capabilities are becoming more robust. The battlefield is becoming denser with respect to air defense capabilities. The reason why this is happening is because of drones. The forces have to respond to the growing drone threat. So the way to do that is by increasing your defense capabilities. And as it happens, I would argue most, maybe even all, of the technologies being fielded to deal with drones also are effective against helicopters. So the air defenses and capabilities aren't expanding because of helicopters, expanding because of the drones, but they're also good for helicopters, right? The other thing that's happening is that drones, unmanned aerial vehicles, are becoming ever more capable, and they are doing more and more of the things that attack helicopters can do. Obviously, attack helicopters are more capable, but still, when you think about the cost of helicopters and the fact that the drones are getting more and more, they're doing more and more of the labor that normally you would assign to attack helicopter, the whole value proposition, the whole idea of the helicopter becomes just more difficult to swallow. Okay, so part 5, concluding remarks. Do attack helicopters have a place on the modern battlefield? It seems to me that if the adversary is 1, competent, 2, has serious air defense capabilities, and 3, for whatever reason, you cannot bring to bear adequate, robust suppression capabilities, air defense suppression capabilities, maybe because of the terrain, maybe because of bad intelligence, maybe because of rules of engagement, whatever, then I think the answer is no. Attack helicopters are too vulnerable. They're getting more vulnerable by the day, and they're a lot of money. Meanwhile, much cheaper unmanned drones are more and more capable of getting the job done, of doing the things that one had intended the helicopters to do. Now, that's true. What about the Poles? Keep in mind that the Poles' only real objective for the military is fighting the Russians. So they don't intend to use their Apaches to do irregular warfare or asymmetrical fights or to go operate in Africa or something like that, or even Afghanistan. No, they intend to use them against the Russians, who obviously have copious and robust air defense capabilities. So why are the Poles doing this? As best as I can tell, the Poles are doing this because this is they're taking it as a given. It's like they're doing it by the book. They understand, because this has been the understanding, that attack helicopters have a place as part of your combined arms force. Alongside, they complement the artillery, and they complement the tanks, and they complement this and that and the other thing, and it just makes sense. Plus, it's probably was part of their doctrine all the way going back, certainly during the Cold War. Speaking of the Cold War, the Poles have, I think, about 24 very old Mi-24s that they need to replace. So they have to replace the 2008 Mi-24s. But since they're growing the overall size of the military, the Poles are probably thinking that you can't just do a one-for-one replacement. You have to get more of these things. Why? Because they probably have a doctrine that says that there's a ratio for a given number of units. You have to have a given number of attack helicopters. Therefore, since they're increasing the number of units, they have to increase the number of attack helicopters. As best as I can tell, and please in the comments tell me I'm wrong or tell me I'm right, right? Tell me, no, actually, Michael, there's this huge debate in Poland, and for whatever reason, the Ministry of Defense did all these studies, and they finally decided that after due consideration, decided that these things are still valuable anyways. But as far as I can tell, that's not the case. They didn't really question it. There wasn't much of a public debate. They just moved ahead, and they agreed to spend the $10 billion on these Apaches. Have they wasted their money? The only argument that you can make for them not wasting their money is the argument that says that it's about the use case. The Poles might be thinking that they're using these helicopters in case in which they're invaded by the Russians. It's a national emergency. And in that kind of context, it's a war of necessity. It's not a war of choice. It doesn't really matter how they get shot down. I mean, realistically, people are going to get killed. But it matters as long as you can draw blood, and as long as the helicopters do function as part of the overall combined arms and joint force and draws a lot of blood, and ideally maybe just deters the Russians from attempting in the first place, then it's actually worth the money. And then it's a really good idea. Thank you very much for watching. Please, again, if you like this video, please hit like and subscribe, of course, if you haven't subscribed already. Plus, in the description, you'll see I've linked to a RAND study that looked at the Russians and also talked a little bit about helicopters. There's also a study that I found is very interesting that gets into the history of sort of American doctrine for helicopters that I think is pretty neat. Also, you'll find links to my Twitter account, my LinkedIn, Blue Sky, also my Substack, Pax Americana. I also call it Pax Americana, and I write for that weekly. And finally, my own website, michaelshirkin.com. There's plenty in the pipeline, so I look forward to seeing you in my next video. Bye-bye.